Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining me. So what we're going to do today is we're going through INSCYD testing for trail and ultra runners, what it is, how we use it, and how it's useful to. It's probably the most useful piece of tech I've seen in a very long time. So let me just tell you quickly who Mindful Runner is. For those who don't know, we're a coaching group. We coach ultra runners, trail runners, but that's our specialty, right? We focus on ultra and trail. And that's where we see INSCYD being such a good fit, because it's going to help us from a training prescription point of view, from a racing point of view, both with pacing and with nutrition. So let's take a look at the benefits of INSCYD versus what's the norm today. So one of the things that normally happens at the moment, most good coaches are using lactate threshold as their anchor point, right? And effectively what that means is you've got lactate threshold being the most, or the fastest you can run for between 40 and 70 minutes, or the highest power you can hold for that period, or the highest heart rate you can hold for that period. So it's speed, power, heart rate, one of those. And that's great. That gives you a starting point. And then typically what happens is we set up zones according to that threshold point. So it's a single anchor. And if I want to now train you to have a VO2 max session, for instance, we'll typically go, well, that's 112 to 120% of a person's lactate threshold. But the truth is that lactate threshold moves up and down, and VO2 max is a genetic limit. So setting that anchor point, although it's useful, isn't specific to the individual athlete anymore. It's now just this general picture. And that's where INSCYD comes in. INSCYD gives us a real view into, if I want to set a VO2 max interval, I will go and say to INSCYD, what are the VO2 max numbers? I will go in, if I want to set a lactate threshold workout, we'll go and see what the lactate threshold numbers are. If we want to work on your glycolytic capacity, we'll go and see what those numbers are. So we have this 360-degree view now. We're looking inside. We're no longer anchoring everything to that single point. How we go about getting the information is it's either a test done on one single workout, or the test is spread over 2 days. Ideally over 2 days, because those who've done it, you'll know it's quite tough. It's quite tough on the body, but there's no bloodletting. You don't have to poke yourself with a needle. There's no treadmill torture. You're not running on a treadmill with a gas mask on. All you need is your GPS. And that'll give us a very high degree of accuracy against somebody being tested in a lab with a cart on and their fingers being pricked. We're within 2 or 3%. And when it comes down to prescription of power or pace, that difference is infinitesimal. It's not big enough to really be concerned about. So we're really happy with what INSCYD produces. And what does it produce? So once we've done the tests, we then upload the information from the individual athlete's workouts. We take those fit files out of Training Peaks, off your Garmin, off your watch, wherever they come from. We take those files, those 2 sets of tests, we upload them into the software on INSCYD, and that gives us a unique biometric fingerprint. Okay, and that biometric fingerprint, as we said, is much more than just one lactate steady state. We're looking at VO2 max, we're looking at your glycolytic max, we're looking at your fat max, at your maximum lactate steady state, which is FTP, critical power, same thing. We're looking at your carb max, and within the next month, also VT1, so that initial ventilatory threshold, which is the top end of what most people define as zone 1, right? VT1 is that defining point. So we'll have that in as well. Now, how do we then take that information? What are we going to do with it? Because it's great. You get this wonderful report. And I have athletes who have done VO2 max reports, and they've done lactate tests, and they get a report, and that's it. What do you then do with that, right? So This is where we take the information. So we've done the test, we get the test results. We now take that information from a training point of view, and we look at the training requirements, because I can see your individual biometric fingerprint. We look at the requirements of the event, and we can see what the demands of that event are. For instance, if you're going to run a desert race with not much climbing in it and not much technical running, that's one particular set of requirements, right? Versus racing an otter, for instance, which is a completely different set of requirements. You need to work on different systems. And so different energy systems come into play. So we can look at the training requirements of the event. We can now look at what the athlete has got currently in terms of the biometric matchup. And we can then create tailored training zones specific to that athlete. As I said earlier, I want to say, what's your VO2 max range in power, in speed, in heart rate? No longer a percentage of something else. Literally, what is the VO2 max that we want to train you at? And then training zones can be set up on pace, on power, or on heart rate. So any of those training zones can also be applicable. We're not limited to one or the other. So that's in training. Super useful from that point of view. I'm sure you can understand that. We look at racing and how we then use that information in racing as well. So when we look at what to do with racing, first off, it's going to give us a really realistic idea of the kind of pace you can hold, especially for an ultra. And my definition of ultra at this stage is pretty loose. It's 5 hours or more, right? That's where we come in. It's like 5 hours or more of racing, and that's an ultra. It's long enough to be out there. What this is going to do is it's going to give you a view of what your substrate utilization is. So how much fat and how much glucose do you burn and at what intensities? And sometimes in a race, that's going to be a limiting factor, right? The amount of carbs you can get in is going to limit the pace you can go at. So from a racing point of view, we can see the pacing you can go at, and we can also see exactly how much you're going to burn in terms of carbs and fats. So let's take a look at INSCYD itself. Quick view, and I'm going to run you through what we have available. I just need to get the right document up. Okay, so you should be now looking at my athlete scorecard. The scorecard, I've got body mass, I have height, weight, body fat percentage, fat-free percentages, right? So that's that particular athlete. This is the biometric fingerprint we were talking about, right? I can see my body fat percentage. Let me just explain this. The outside of this spider web is 100%. As we move in, each line represents another 25% in until we get down to 0. So that outer ring is 75, 50, 25, and 0. Now, mostly you want to go as high as possible. So if you look at, except for things like body fat and VLA max, but I'll explain those shortly. So if we look at my VO2 max, you'll see it's very low. And this particular fingerprint is comparing me to my peer group. Okay, so it's looking at recreational male athletes in my age group, and it's going, your VO2 max is pretty low compared to those guys. Your VLA max is also low. I'll explain those shortly. My Carb Max, it's not even over 50%. So these are all areas I know as an athlete now, or as a coach, I can work on these areas. I can improve my VO2 max. There's lots of room to move to get better, right? Body fat percentage, we can still drop that. There's space to go on that. Fat max, I want to improve that. The only thing that I'm pretty good at right now is that my lactate threshold is close to my VO2 max. And this is a good picture generally. If you're an ultra athlete, you want to have your lactate threshold close to your VO2 max. And there's my lactate steady state, also in a lower percentile. So it can be worked on. So the encouraging thing about this view is there's a lot of space for me to make improvements. Now, that information is this is just a different interpretation of that spider web. You can see This is a standard. Imagine this as a Rev Counter. So the more red you can see, the better, right? The higher the value. There's my VO2 max percentage based on my test, or actual VO2 max based on test. There's my VLA max, or my ability to use glucose, glycolytic power. And typically you would see this very low in an ultra athlete, because this is your cellular glycogen and your ability to use cellular glycogen. If you've got that ability, then you're not using a lot of fat. And that's the other side, right? From an ultra running point of view, I want to be good at using fat as fuel, but I'll show you more information on that shortly. Then I'm looking at my maximum lactate steady state. Remember we said this maximum lactate steady state is the pace you can run at for between 40 minutes and 70 minutes, right? So somewhere between your 10K and your half marathon, depending on how quick you are. So my lactate steady state is 514. Fat max, and I'll dig more into this a little soon. Fat max is where I'm burning the most fat, and it's at that particular pace, right? Where fat is the bigger contribution to my energy requirements. It's bigger than carbs are. And then I have a Carb Max, and Carb Max is currently set at a hard number. We'll get into that shortly as well, of 90 grams of carbs per hour. And if I am consuming at a pace of 717, I burn 90 grams of carbs per hour. Okay. So if we assumed that I could not ingest more than 90 grams of carbs per hour, then that's a limiter, right? I can't race faster than 717, except that I'm starting out with 475 grams of carbs in my body, in my running muscles right now. And again, these are test results. So I'm starting out with 475 grams of carbs in my muscles. If I use 90 grams of carbs per hour, then at least I've got in here 5 hours of racing before I'm absolutely tapped out. Now, under normal circumstances, I wouldn't recommend that you run to tapping that out, but it's close, right? So 90 grams would be 450. I'd be left with 25 grams, just barely enough. So at this pace of 717, I could race for 5 hours before I was out of glycogen. And at that point, I would have to start topping up. And I'd have to start topping up at 90 grams of carbs per hour. Okay. To maintain that pace. If I slow down, we'll have a look at that shortly. If I slow down, then I can use less carbs. So let's take a look in a little more detail. I'm going to gloss over some of these early two graphs here because they don't have a lot of relevance to nutrition, the nutritional stuff we're talking about now. But effectively, this is just looking at how I burn oxygen, how effectively I'm burning oxygen. And it is important when we start looking at improving VO2 max, and a graph on how quickly I recover from using lactate as fuel. Okay, at a point, and literally at that point there, 516, I can no longer burn all the lactate that I'm producing. And that's where you see the pink line just shooting up. So at a pace of, 410, I'm producing almost 2 millimoles of lactate. Okay, so that's what that graph tells us. The two really important ones right now from our ultra running point of view is this one on the left in terms of lactate production. So the blue line is indicating to me how much lactate I can burn or I can work off, all right? And the red line is how much lactate I'm producing. So as long as blue is above red, I'm good, right? I'm clearing all the lactate that my body's producing. At that crossover point, right there, at roughly 516, the numbers I'm looking at, by the way, are the speed down below here as I move the graph. So at that crossover point at roughly 516 and power of 304 watts, that's where I'm just about square, right? I'm utilizing all of the lactate I'm producing. And then past that point, I'm now running out of the ability to continue running because lactate will build up to the point that my muscles don't want to work anymore. Okay. So useful when we're looking at improvements here mean lifting either VO2 max, so push your ability to burn oxygen. The blue line is your ability to burn oxygen, represented by VO2 max, right? Push the blue line up, And if I push that blue line up to there, all of a sudden I could be running at a pace of 436 and still be clearing lactate, right? Or push my lactate clearing over to the right. And if I pushed it over to 410, excuse me, I would still be able to clear lactate at that pace. So the blue line, we work on VO2 max, and those are VO2 max styled intervals. In order to improve the red line, we work on lactate steady state work, right? Just around about above and below lactate steady state will improve your ability to clear lactate and lactate intervals. Okay, so that's a good look at where I can make improvements. When I showed you earlier my VO2 max needs work, what the impact of those improvements would be as I lift my VO2 max, so I'm able to burn more lactate. Okay. Then the really important one from our perspective as ultra runners, because fueling is such a vital part of any seriously long run, this graph on the right, fat and carbohydrate combustion. So if we look, the orange represented by this line running along the base of the graph between 60 and 100, and the right-hand side is grams of carbs per hour. So that orange represents 60 to 90 grams of carbs per hour. Currently, the scientifically supported maximum carb burning rate. There's lots of anecdotes and lots of rumors in the market of people getting in 120 grams of carbs and 160 grams of carbs. That's not currently scientifically backed. What is scientifically backed is you can get in 90 grams of carbs before your stomach starts rejecting it. Okay, so typically what will happen is when you get in too many carbs, either you're going to be throwing up or it's coming out the other end, right? Because your carbs are just, there's too much in your body, and your brain and your body are literally rejecting what you have. So 90 grams of carbs is what we want to be able to burn. And that's, for me, well above in my fat max, I am able to burn up to 461 kilocalories. So the green bar, the upright bar, and the green line represent my fat max. Okay, so how my fat is burnt as I'm racing or as I'm exercising. So you can see, for me, that starts out at a pace of 941 is my slowest pace, and 758. So somewhere between 8 and 940 is where I am burning the most fat possible. And fat is a big contribution. But if you take a look, you'll see that the red line, carbs, are still making a contribution there. I'm not running without carbs. So that is 458 kilocalories coming from fat at that pace, and 306 kilocalories or 73 grams of carbs at this pace. So that's my total requirement at that pace, being met by fat and carbs. And as I go faster, I move further right on the graph, you will see that there comes a point where carbs are now a bigger influence than fat. And for me, that crossover point is at 656, call it 7. And then there comes a point where fat is no longer able to contribute. There is a point, a pace, at which your body has to work so fast, your cells have to work so hard that they can no longer burn fat. Okay, and when you're running at that pace, obviously there is a finite amount of time before your body runs dry and goes, right, that's it, bonk, no more carbs available. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's what is available there. So if you think about what happens with a race, let's assume you were going to do a 6-hour race. You know what your projected finishing time would be. I don't know, let's go, well, we're saying it's a 6-hour race, right? So in a 6-hour race, I want to race, say, at a pace of, let's call it 7 minutes a K. It's a trail, I want to go at 7 minutes a K. And at 7 minutes a K, I need 413 or 98 grams of carbs. The fat is a given, right? The fat's on my body. I'm burning that anyway. So I don't have to ingest the fat, but I do need to add the carbs, right? So at that pace, At 7 minutes a K, I've got to add back 98 grams of carbs, and I can't. So I can't even race at 7 minutes a K for an extended period because I'd have to take in almost 100. So my Carb Max, we said earlier, was at 720. So running at 720, if I take in 90 grams of carbs an hour for 6 hours, that's 540 grams, right? It's 6 by 90, it's 540 grams. And I started, remember what we said earlier? I started my starting value. If I'm rested in my muscles, I have 475 grams of carbs. So 540 is what I need to run at that pace of 717 less 475. I need 65 grams of carbs additional to what I have on my body for that 6 hours, which is minor, right? Divide that by the 6 hours. I need literally 11 carbs an hour in order to finish that event. Small amount and a relatively comfortable pace. Okay. So that's how we'd use the carb or your substrate information to plan your racing, but from a pacing point of view, because we can see what your maximum is. But also, if we dig into the actual zones, we know, for instance, if I'm going to run a 100 miler or 100K or even a 50 miler, ideally, I want to be in this fat max space, right? Burn as much fat as possible, as little in the way of carbs as possible. And these are the training zones now. So we've now derived training zones from the test, and I'm able to say, right, at base pace, my lowest, at the lower end of base, my power is 204 watts, and at the upper end is 227, so the target is 217, right? And from a pace point of view, my slowest pace at base is 904. My quickest pace at base is 741, and my average is 815. So if I were looking at training that zone 1, just base pace, I would be training at an average pace of around about between 741 and 815. That's where I'd stick it. And then you can see, look at the lactate contribution, it's 1.3. Now we know that when you go over 2, usually that's where the problem is, right? Once you're getting past 2 millimoles, you're starting to get lactate buildup. So this is a really comfortable pace. I'm burning 49 grams of carbs. I'm still burning 49 grams of fat, still burning 70 grams of carbs at a heart rate of 129. And that should be that long, steady distance run. And it feels very, very comfortable when you're running at that pace. Okay. Fat max, if we want to really focus on fat burning, then there my numbers are, right? I can see the fat max zone. Bang. And that's what I want to train on. Now, what that's going to do is it's going to utilize as much fat for fuel as possible on your body. And it's going to not so much teach your body, but you're going to adapt to burning fat properly. Okay, and there's a number of different protocols we can use to improve your fat max capabilities. But if you think about the fact that the more energy you can get contributed to by fat, the less carbs you need, or the flip side of that is not the less carbs you need, but if you can get more energy from fat and use the same amount of carbs, you can go faster, right? Because you're not limited by the amount of energy you can get in. And yeah, that's training zones. There's a lot more information here, and there's a lot more ways to utilize the information. But effectively now we've looked at the report you'll get out. And that report at the end of the whole process, everybody gets a paper report. We work through this, but then we also produce a paper report, right? Which then comes out in PDF format and gets shipped off to everybody. Okay, let me stop that. As there will be an opportunity for questions once we wrap this up. I need to get back to my slideshow. Okay. So that's what the report looks like. Do we have any questions at this stage? Just put your hand up Type your questions in. I'm not seeing any questions. Okay, I'm going to assume there are no questions. That's great. Love it. I must have been really thorough. Okay, well, that wraps it up then. That's INSCYD. If you want to get a test done, get a hold of your coach, get a hold of me. We can get testing. As we said, the test is non-invasive, but we can, if we need to, we can add in lactate threshold testing at the same time. We can do blood tests. If you're in Johannesburg, we can meet with you. We can do blood tests at the same time. So it'll add maybe 1 or 2% more accuracy to the results, but it's not going to be significant in terms of planning your racing, nutrition, or your training. It's just maybe you want to know what the lactate numbers are specifically. All right, and this is the first in a series of talks that I plan on doing. The next will be out next week, Tuesday. A tech talk with Mindful Runner. What I want to look at doing is exploring technology from GPS watches, our coaching, and look at how that works for us, how it can enhance your training without losing sight of the mindfulness. You know, we're not dominated by tech. We use the tech, and we use it in order to create perfect practice, right? A way to measure that what you're doing is correct. It's that deliberate practice idea. And what INSCYD has now given us the ability to do is we can look at much more specific things that we're training for, and then train for them now, do the benchmark. 3 months time, we look back and we go, are we hitting those targets? You know, it's not just a case of let's prep for races. It's also a case of, are we improving what we want to improve? And the best way to do that is test, right? Test, test, test. So going forward, we'll have a series like once a week. We'll go through different aspects of technology that enhance our coaching practice and can make a difference in your lives. Okay. And that's all from me. Anybody else have any more they want to say? No? Okay, cool. Thanks very much for joining me. I hope you got some value from this. I hope to see a bunch of you signing up for some tests. Let's get some good data going. Enjoy the rest of your evening.